Welcome to Haaretz.com. I'm Amy Amiga and I'm here with Dr. Gary Ackerman, Director of the Special Projects Division at START, the largest terrorism research institute in the world. He's based in the United States but is currently in Israel to speak at the International Institute for Counterterrorism's annual conference at the IDC Herzliya. And he joins us here at Haaretz to discuss US President Barack Obama's latest plan to combat Islamic State. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gary Ackerman.
Hello, Amy. It's good to be here.
In his speech on Wednesday night, President Obama indicated a willingness to authorise airstrikes against Islamic State in Syria. Now, this poses a marked difference in his attitudes beforehand because he was quite reluctant to get involved in the Syrian civil war. Does this effectively turn Obama into Assad's ally?
Not at all, Amy. That is a good question, though. The administration was very clear and drew a sharp distinction between its mission to degrade and attack ISIS, and it was very clear that it still regards the Assad regime as illegitimate and is still working to remove the Assad regime. So they were very clear about that. Their aims are purely against ISIS in terms of this airstrike.
So how does this complicate then Obama's overall ambitions in Syria, since he is against Assad but he's in favour of more moderate rebels than the Islamic State?
So Obama has never been interested in becoming very involved in the Syrian conflict. So this vastly complicates things because there are now 3 different parties in Syria against which the United States is directing its policy. There's the Assad regime, which the United States is indirectly encouraging its removal through the support of the Syrian opposition. Then there's ISIS, which is a part of the Syrian opposition that the United States is directly attacking. And then there's the moderate Syrian opposition the United States seeks to support and empower. This can vastly complicate the situation because it might seem that these distinctions are very clear when it comes to a policy, when you're sitting in a policy room in the White House, but on the ground things can be very messy. The situation is dynamic, territory is shifting, there's lots of conflict between different forces, and there's always the possibility that there will be an accident and that once the United States is bombing on the ground in Syria, that it could target the wrong forces. Syrians are working closely with Iranian representatives of the Pasdaran and with Hezbollah, and if the United States mistakenly bombs then, that could vastly complicate things by escalating a situation vis-a-vis Syria and the Iranian governments.
Could there also be a situation in which the United States accidentally arms the Islamic State militants or extremists?
Yes, and that has been the concern all along. All along, the argument against arming any of the Syrian rebels was that you don't know who you're arming. You could give somebody a gun today and they could be a quote-unquote member of a moderate group, and tomorrow they could go join ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliated group there. And so that we don't want a repeat of what happened in Afghanistan, where the United States essentially ended up arming what was to become al-Qaeda. However, the White House is now saying that they can distinguish, they now know who the quote-unquote good rebels are from the bad rebels, and they can arm and support the good rebels. So it may be a dangerous gamble to arm any parties in Syria, but it's now become something, I think, a gamble that the American administration is willing to take.
What about the implications of international law? This would effectively constitute America invading another sovereign state.
That's an excellent question, Amy. According to international law, you cannot conduct airstrikes on a sovereign state without that state's permission, and airstrikes in Syria would seem to contravene the sovereignty of Syria. However, I think there's quite a nuanced argument that is being made that the areas controlled by ISIS are really ungoverned spaces, or they're not, at least not governed, and they don't fall under Syrian government sovereignty. So therefore, by conducting airstrikes against the ISIS areas, you're not really contravening international law. Now that is very tricky because there are no fixed borders to the ISIS areas. It's a shifting, fluid situation, and so if you start bombing in those border areas, are you actually bombing Syrian territory, or are you bombing an ungoverned ISIS-controlled territory?
Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Gary Ackerman.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for part 1 of our conversation on counter-terrorism measures against Islamic State. Join us for part 2, where we'll look at who's likely to join the US-led coalition against Islamic State. I'm Amy Amiga, and you're on Haaretz.com.